Hello everyone, this is Tom Fox. I'm the Compliance Evangelist, and I'd like to welcome you to another special series on the Compliance Podcast Network of Adventures in Compliance. Over the next 5 podcast episodes, we're going to take a look at stories from the Casebook of Sherlock Holmes and what they can tell us and inform us about both leadership and your compliance program. We will consider the 3 Garadevs, the Problem of Thor Bridge, the Creeping Man, the Lion's Mane. We'll conclude with the Veiled Lodger. I know you will find them illuminating, and as an aficionado of Sherlock Holmes, it's a lot of fun. Adventures in Compliance is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network. The Problem of Thor Bridge, and Monitoring Controls. Welcome back to another episode of Adventures in Compliance, where we consider the intersection of Sherlock Holmes and compliance. This week we are taking a look at stories in the Casebook of Sherlock Holmes, mining them for themes and lessons related to the compliance profession, leadership, and business ethics. In today's offering, I consider the Problem of Thor Bridge. From the story, we take the Holmes utterance, "We must look for consistency, for there is want of it, we must suspect deception." This informs our discussion on monitoring controls. In this story, Neil Gibson, the Gold King, approaches Holmes to investigate the murder of his wife Maria in order to clear his children's governess, Grace Dunbar, of the crime. Maria Gibson was found lying in a pool of blood on Thor Bridge with a bullet through her head and a note from the governess agreeing to a meeting at that location in her hand. A recently discharged revolver with one shot fired is found in Miss Dunbar's wardrobe. Holmes agrees to look at the situation in spite of the damning evidence. From the outset, Holmes observes some rather odd things about the case. How could Miss Dunbar so coolly and rationally have planned and carried out the murder, then so carelessly have tossed the murder weapon into her wardrobe? What is the strange chip on the underside of the bridge's stone balustrade? Why was Mrs. Gibson clutching the note from Miss Dunbar when she died? If the murder weapon was one of a matched pair of pistols, why couldn't the other one be found in Mr. Gibson's collection? Holmes uses his power of deduction to solve the crime and demonstrates using Watson's revolver how it was perpetrated. Mrs. Gibson, outraged and jealous of Miss Dunbar's relationship with her husband, resolved to end her own life and frame her rival for the crime. After arranging a meeting with Miss Dunbar and requesting her to leave her response in a note, Mrs. Gibson tied a rock on a piece of string to the end of the revolver, shot herself, the rock pulling the revolver over the other side of the bridge. The revolver found in Miss Dunbar's wardrobe was the other pistol of the pair which had been fired in the woods earlier, and the chip in the bridge which was caused by the pistol hitting the stonework as it was pulled off by the rock. Holmes' reconstruction reproduces the damage to the bridge. He asked police to drag the leg for the revolvers of Watson and Gibson, Watson's revolver being used in the demonstration. How do you determine the want of consistency that Holmes spoke of? Well, monitoring controls is the key. The 5th and final objective of the COSO 2013 Internal Controls Framework is entitled Monitoring Activities. The framework notes that ongoing evaluations, separate evaluations, and combination of the two should be used to ascertain whether each of the 5 components of internal controls is present and functioning. However, as with all components of the COSO formulation, monitoring activities are part of an interrelated whole and cannot be taken singularly. This objective applies to all 5 components of the internal control, and the nature of monitoring should fit the organization, its dependence on IT, and the effectiveness of monitoring, providing relevant feedback on all other components. For the Chief Compliance Officer or the compliance practitioner, monitoring activities has been growing in importance over the past few years, and indeed the Evaluation of Corporate Compliance Programs 2019 FCPA guidance recently released by the Department of Justice reinforces this. It is important to ensure that adequate controls are present in support of all relevant principles and the controls before launching into efforts to see if they are functioning. Remember that the relevant principles of the COSO framework must be present and functioning for a company to safely conclude their ICFR is effective. Aligning the design of controls to the 17 principles to see if any gaps early in the implementation process will help ensure adequate time to test for operational effectiveness. This same is equally, if not more so, true for your compliance function. Monitoring activity objective consists of 2 principles. the organization selects and develops and performs ongoing evaluation. And 2, it evaluates and communicates internal control deficiencies timely to parties, up to and including the board of directors. So what's Principle 16? Here, your monitoring should be noted as part of, required by the 2019 guidance I earlier referenced. The reason is simple. Ongoing evaluations are complementary tools to test the effectiveness of your compliance program. The same is true of internal controls. For any compliance practitioner, there are several areas and concepts you will need to consider going forward. A current risk assessment or other evaluation of business changes should be considered based upon the baseline of understanding of your underlying compliance risk. Whatever you select, it will need to be integrated with your ongoing business processes and adjusted as appropriate through ongoing risk assessment evaluations, objectively evaluated. Principle 17, evaluation and communication of the deficiencies. This principle speaks to deficiencies and their correction. It requires the determination of what might constitute deficiency in your internal control and who is responsible for taking corrective action and whether there's evidence that corrective action was taken. In other words, document. For this principle, the CCO will need to take timely and determined action to correct any deficiencies that might appear in your compliance program. It will require you to assess results, communicate the deficiencies up the chain to the board or compliance committee, correct them, then monitor the corrective action going forward. I would urge that every key internal control in support of the 17 principles laid out in the COSO framework be reviewed. Monitoring activities should bring together your entire compliance program and should give you a sense of whether it is running properly. Both ongoing monitoring and auditing are tools the CCO and compliance practitioner should use in support of this objective. Near the end of this section, Rittenberg states, monitoring is a key component of the internal control framework because effective monitoring recognizes dynamics of change within your organization and provides the basis for corrective action if needed. I would add it certainly allows you to evaluate the effectiveness of the corrective action. The most important item to note is that internal controls need to be sustainable. You cannot build one-off controls and have the process in place to help you monitor all the controls that you need to cover. Controls cannot be a one and done. Many companies are going to find that initial approach insufficient. There must be a mechanism in place for communication of controls which do not work or can readily be overridden. From there, you must be able to remediate your controls going forward. This will align the compliance professional's requirement to prevent, detect, and remediate going forward. I hope you'll join us tomorrow for Adventures in Compliance, where we consider the adventure of the creeping man. For listening to this episode of Adventures in Compliance. If you have any questions on anything I've talked about, please feel free to contact me at tfox@tfoxlaw.com. Adventures in Compliance has been a special presentation of the Compliance Podcast Network.